Hi, my name is Tamara. I am a white person, and I've said some pretty stupid things. I've got some flack, actually, from my title this morning. I was wondering if anyone would show up. Glad to see you. So let me just be sure we're on the same page. I'm pretty clear that white people are not the only people who say stupid things, just in case you were wondering. We all say stupid things. People of color say stupid things. Straight people, gay people say stupid things. Really well-intended people of all sorts say all kinds of really, really stupid things. Now, it's African American History Month, and so I thought we might look at some of the ways in which really well-intended people, in an attempt to connect with people of color, actually distance themselves even further from the people of color with whom they are trying to connect. All Souls is no stranger to racial justice work. Marlon and I inherited a legacy of civil rights work from John Wolfe. Today, many of our lay leaders have been participating in intercultural competency work for almost 4 years. They've been learning about the ways in which they respond to difference. Most of us fall into a category of wanting to minimize differences in order to get along. That's worked to get us this far in our commingled history. But the next steps, if we're to better our multicultural world, is to recognize the benefits afforded white people merely for the color of their skin. And to be able to recognize and hold the complexity of racial experience in this country with the people whom we encounter. To be an ally and speak up when other people say stupid things, and to try to say fewer stupid things ourselves, and when we do, honor the impact of our words, honor the pain, and stay at the table. We actually added a new program this year for racial justice, which will be available to everyone next year, called Groundwork. It's a YWCA-sponsored program of what we call racial caucusing, opportunities for white people to get together to talk about race. And because it's offered here, we also look specifically at the impact of race within the context of our church. It is very powerful. There's a compatible program for people of color called Mosaic, and it may feel a bit counterintuitive to you, but this kind of segregated identity conversation is actually the next step in helping you to build an authentic interracial relationship. You have to begin by knowing yourself. Now, I'm a firm believer that we need to work both angles. A skill-building model, this intercultural competency work that we've been doing, which offers tools on how to better engage with differences and broadens the definition of culture, as well as racial caucusing, where people have an opportunity to explore their racial identity and how it plays out for them. It is hard work. It is fulfilling work. It is necessary work. Now, this is going to be painful, but I'm going to read to you a list of things that I've heard really well-intended white folk say that have unintentionally widened the diversity gap between themselves and the person of color within earshot. You may have never said a single one of these things. You may have thought some of these things. Or maybe you didn't know what to say when the people around you said them. So I'm hoping to give you some responses this morning. And remember, anything you say in response to these kind of comments, hold them in compassion while you respond. I truly believe they know not what they do. And let me also say that if you would like to read more about why some of these things are not okay, there's a really great book by a trainer named Maura Cullen called 35 Dumb Things Well-Intended People Say, Surprising Things We Say That Widen the Diversity Gap. And I could spend a sermon on each one of them. And although there's some humor in what I'm talking about today, the topic is quite serious. Racism will not end until those in power understand how they continue to contribute to the problem. So, the first comment. I don't think of you as black. I don't see color. I'm colorblind. Or, I don't see difference. We're all part of the same race, the human race. Or, I don't care if you're pink, purple, or orange. I treat all people the same. Or, yes, but you're a good one. You might consider that saying any of these is not a compliment, because the implication is that having color is actually a diminishment. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we trying to bestow some kind of honorary whiteness on a person of color? That's what it sounds like, and they don't want it. And the next. I know exactly how you feel. No, actually, you don't. Let's just eliminate this one altogether, actually, not just out of racism, but really pretty much any time you say, I know exactly how you feel, it's likely that you probably don't. You cannot relate to a person of color's experience of racism because you believe you've encountered a similar situation or been in a minority situation. The way that we will continue to move forward is when white folks own that as a white person, we have never experienced what it's like to be a person of color. And we never will. A personal instance of pain or being in the minority is not the same as a lifetime of oppression. And the next. There are so many black people who've made it. Look at Condoleezza Rice, Ben Carson, Colin Powell, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, Barack Obama. Why can't other people of color get ahead? Madam C.J. Walker was the first black millionaire in the early part of the 20th century when lynchings were still going on. No one would say things were equal then, but she was a famous millionaire. The real question is, how many more people like Oprah would there be if there were, in fact, equality? Consider why you aren't an all-star basketball player or why you didn't invent something famous. Every culture has exceptional individuals, but most of us are pretty ordinary. And the next one. If anyone just works hard enough, they'll get ahead. This is one of the operative myths of our culture, a meritocracy. Any comparative statistic of all the socioeconomic indicators shows that structural inequality is the reality. So denying it does not help us get any closer in relationship. A lot of people who are working really hard are not getting ahead, regardless of the color of their skin. And another. I've heard people try to get out of the race conversation with, we just need to trust and respect each other. It's all just about trust and respect. Now consider whether that isn't a part of any genuine relationship and why it needs to be highlighted in this particular instance. You see, respect has to be earned. In an interracial relationship, there is an added gap of hurt and misunderstanding that we bring with us. Trust is built on authentic interactions of being able to hold different experiences. It takes knowing ourselves, it takes knowing our history, and it takes knowing our culture. And another. Why can't they just let go of the past? Racism is here in the present. Whites still benefit from white privilege. People of color are still oppressed by racist institutions. Asking people of color to let go of the past history of racial injustice in this country is actually asking them to deny their present reality, the reality that such injustice still occurs. You see, the cover of the history book of America may have changed, but the pages are still being written. Dr. King spoke of the lives of African Americans being crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Today, segregation and discrimination still bind people of color. However, the oppressor has changed clothes and is now disguised in the disparities of education, healthcare, and the economy, sentencing laws, and the war on drugs. And another. I didn't own slaves. My family didn't own slaves. I wasn't even born yet when people were enslaved. Or, it's so much better than it used to be. Just be patient. You benefit from a country that was built by slavery. You benefit from a race that was created. If you don't know the early legal history of the colonies and how they wrote into law inequities based on what it meant to be not white. Shelley Tochelk writes, "The American self became a white self as negative portrayals of disparaged and oppressed groups defined what was un-American and therefore not white." The history is there. You can read it in Tochelk's book, Witnessing Whiteness, or Theodore Allen's book, The Invention of the White Race. Despite this history, though, every white person alive today benefits from white privilege right here, right now, even in the 21st century. You may not be responsible for the enslavement of the past, but that doesn't change your responsibility for how you knowingly or unknowingly perpetuate racism today. And racism is not just prejudice. It's prejudice plus power. And discrimination is not the same thing as structural racism. You see, in our society, whites have the vast majority of power in institutions such as schools and courts, corporations, and maintenance of national narratives. Individual people of color may be biased against whites, just as whites are biased against people of color. But the difference is that whites have institutional power to consistently deny resources and rights to people of color, impacting their life choices and their life chances. People of color do not have similar power to use their bias in that way. People of color have been written out of history. We heard Philip Mwagali's, the author of that reading that I share, offer a story about a land without African Americans to make a point about what we are leaving out. This story stunned me the first time that I read it. I was not stunned by the inventions of African Americans. I was surprised once again at how history is told in this country in such a very specific way that nearly all the key players are still white. Did it shock you? We're given a simplified, watered-down version of the truth, and there are consequences to perpetuating that story. If you're not familiar with the privileges of being white in this country, Peggy McIntosh has a great sneak peek into white privilege that you can track down called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's all over the web if you want to look for it. Moving our privilege from our unconscious to our conscious mind helps us to describe what white privilege makes one newly accountable and better ally. So understanding that privilege makes us a better ally and makes us newly accountable. Some of the things that she describes, if you've never seen that document. She writes, "I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it was. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race in history. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color to not work against the appearance of financial reliability. And lastly, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. These are just 10. She lists 50. There are hundreds. I'm still uncovering ways in which I am blind to my own privilege, and I am very invested in this work. The ways in which I'm afforded power that I didn't earn and that I don't deserve simply because of the color of my skin. This is a complicated story for me personally, especially as I've been doing a lot of family history work in order to understand my own racial makeup and the DNA that I carry with me, not just the color of my skin, but the history of my people. You see, I am actually a registered Perdido Bay Native American. My family on my father's side were Creek and forced out of Florida and Alabama, and they came to Oklahoma. Some merged with the Choctaw and others with the Creek. But you wouldn't know that by looking at me. My family considered themselves fortunate to have small features that as we intermarried became even less obvious. I actually found 2 different census documents that show one entry where we are described as Native and another entry just a few years after where we are listed as white. My family hid their Native American connections to avoid discrimination and death. I tell you this because understanding the complexity of your white identity is important. Entire groups of Europeans were whitewashed in order to create class dynamics that benefited certain people over others for cheap labor. I tell you this because part of the work is learning your own story, in addition to the American story. And to understand how that story has been told over the past 300 years and how it impacts who you are today and how you move through the world. I want to tell you another story that had a significant impact on me in considering what my role and responsibility should be in racial justice work. Tim Wise, author and diversity speaker, came to Tulsa about 4 years ago and told this story, and I've never looked at my role in this work the same way. He said, "Shortly after I graduated from college, I made the decision to move into a large house with 9 other roommates." He said, "Please note, and let me spare you the experience, this is never a good idea. But we thought at the time it would be great. It would be really cheap, and we could even share grocery expenses and take turns cooking so as to share the responsibility for the group. And one night, about 2 weeks into our little experiment in collective living, one of my roommates made a big pot of gumbo, because that's what you do in New Orleans. And when I returned home from work that night, my roommate asked me if I wanted some. I said no, having already eaten, but I asked him to please save me some and to put it in the fridge for the next day, as I might take it to work with me. And then I went upstairs to my room and watched TV and went to bed. The next morning, I came down for my coffee before heading out the door, and what do I see but that pot of gumbo, half full, still sitting on the front left burner of the stove, on simmer all night long. No portion of it had been saved for me, but more to the point, a great quantity of food had gone to waste. I was upset. Having little time on my hands, I thought to myself, perhaps I should clean up this mess. But then I caught myself and thought, wait a minute. I didn't make this mess. This isn't my fault, and so I'm not cleaning it up. And I took my self-righteous butt right on out the door and went to work. About 6 o'clock that evening, I returned home and noticed another roommate cooking that evening's dinner on the front right burner of the stove, but on the front left burner was still that giant pot of gumbo getting nastier and crustier and funkier by the minute. I asked roommate number 2, "What are you doing? Why were you cooking around last night's dinner, and why hadn't you cleaned up the first?" To which he responded, he hadn't made that mess. It wasn't his fault, and so he shouldn't have to clean it up. Logic with which I could hardly argue, as indeed I had said exactly the same thing just a few hours earlier. And so I grabbed a plate of that night's meal, went to my room, did some work, and went to bed. 7 a.m. came. I had forgotten to set my alarm, but I really didn't need one, for I assure you that when gumbo has been sitting on a stove for 36 hours, the smell will extend far beyond the kitchen, travel up the stairs, down the hall, under your door, through your keyhole, and assault you in a way that I cannot possibly describe. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. And so now I was mad. I bolted down the stairs, glared at the pot of gumbo as if somehow I expected it to return the stare. I saw it sitting there, now even nastier and funkier, and there was not a roommate in sight. And it was at that point that I said to myself, I may not have made this mess. This may not be my fault, but I am going to clean it up simply because I am tired of living in the funk. Wise says we ought to do this work in helping to make racial justice a reality, not because we are to blame for its creation, but because we are responsible for its eradication, because we are alive here and now with the funk. All month long, We're celebrating African American history through the lens of music. It's a program called Soulful Journey, and each week we'll explore a new era and genre of music to highlight its significance in American history and highlight the African American struggle. It's the same service, as I mentioned, at 10 and 11:30. I hope you will stay. They begin with Out of Africa, touching on the music and rhythms born of Africa and slavery in America. I need to tell you that last year's Soulful Journey had a profound impact on many people in this congregation. Watching people whom we know and love sing slave songs in costume, put a face on history that was only intellectual before, but became visceral, palpable. Next week, they'll trace the progress of jazz, ragtime, and blues. And then on February 16th, they do soul and gospel, rhythm and blues, protest music, and the roots of rock and roll. And then on February 23rd, pop, hip-hop, praise music, and the ways that music continues to help people transcend their circumstances and transform the world. This is much more than a musical journey. It tells the story of a people and helps us understand our own lives. And so I leave you with the words of Maya Angelou. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Let the stench of what is still wrong today wake you. Rise and help us clean the pot.